What is the difference between a Federal Reserve debt note and outright plantation style slavery? I think you're probably into Bitcoin and you're saying that fiat is slavery. So where they're going with that is because we have a fiat system, we're always going to be in a perpetual state of inflation. And if we're in a perpetual state of inflation, since wages usually lag the rate of inflation, your purchasing power over time is going to decrease and decrease and decrease. Like it's why we've seen back in the 1950s, 60s, how one income could support a family easily. And now, well, not even two incomes can for the average Joe and Jane. Also, the only way to get ahead in that type of environment is to speculate. You have to buy stocks, you have to buy GameStop, you have to buy Tesla, you have to buy whatever. And that's the only way to get ahead because you can't get ahead in your normal job because your wages aren't keeping up with the rate of inflation. And because we have this fiat system, it creates this perpetual, inevitable inflation, which is why when you look at a chart, you can see the dollar has lost 98% of its value since 1913. And therefore, fiat equals slavery. It makes you a slave to this fiat system. Or if we didn't have this fiat system, we wouldn't have inflation. And if we didn't have inflation, we had actual productivity, which created deflation. Then you wouldn't have to speculate. You wouldn't have to take all this risk. You wouldn't have to buy or be a house flipper or whatever just to get ahead because your wages, instead of losing value, would actually be increasing in purchasing power, assuming that your wages stayed the same or you actually had nominal wage increases because prices going down, wages going up, purchasing power goes up. And this is very similar to what we saw in the 1800s, where from 1870 to 1900 roughly, we had about 45% deflation. Prices went down by almost 50% in the last 30, 35 years of the 1800s. And you might say, well, George, well, that's terrible because if prices were going down, oh my gosh, people must have been out of work and we must have had this massive economic depression. And no, actually, no. Wages, and I'm not talking about real wages, I'm talking about nominal wages, went up, not down. So think about how that increased the purchasing power of the average Joe and Jane. So I just wanted to set up your question. So I think people most likely see where you're coming from. And I apologize if this isn't where you're coming from, but I've just seen this terminology used so often that 99 out of 100 times, this is the premise. So what is the difference between a Federal Reserve debt note? So basically a Federal Reserve note, basically a bank note issued by the Fed. I guess, again, I have to read into your question just to answer it. I guess what you're asking me is how do we get out of the system? I don't, with a fiat system, how can we eliminate slavery? I think I'd ask you, Greg, in a system of sound money, how do you eliminate slavery if the majority of the population want a significant degree of government spending as a percentage of GDP? So, and I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because I don't even know if that's what you're asking. But I think the way I'd answer this question is I'd encourage you, instead of asking the question, what is the difference between a Federal Reserve note and outright plantation style slavery? I think you would be better served to try to answer the question, what is the difference between an increasing amount of government spending as a percentage of GDP and outright communism? Because what you're at the heart of what you're trying to ask, and again, I completely apologize if I'm putting words in your mouth, but at the heart of what you're trying to ask is inflation. It's consumer price inflation and perpetual, consistent consumer price inflation. But what this assumes is that we always have that or always would have that under a fiat system. Why? Because the money supply increases. And if the money supply increases, then you're going to have inflation. But if we go back to that time in the 1800s that I was referring to, where we had 45% deflation, M2 money supply went up by 400%. 400. And we had 45% deflation. Compare that to 1990 to 2020, when we had roughly 125% inflation and M2 money supply went up by 400%. The exact same. The exact same. So I'm not saying that fiat is good. I think it's very desirable to have sound money. But I'm saying the increase in money supply doesn't necessarily, and sometimes it can, but it doesn't necessarily tell you a lot about the rate of consumer price inflation. What is, in my research, what's far more significant is the rate of increase relative to real GDP. Because if the economy is creating enough goods and services where all this lending that's being created, which is increasing money supply, is going to productive lending, then you're not going to see consumer price inflation. You're going to see all of that deflation that we saw in the 1800s when we have fractional reserve banking and the M2 money supply went up by 400%. So the secret there, the key, I think, is real GDP. Then what's real GDP about? Well, I think that's government spending as a percentage of GDP. Because think about this. Let's take it to an extreme. If you had 100% of the government spending producing 100% of economic output, or if economic output was 100% a result of government spending, how efficient do you think that economy would be? Do you think they'd be producing a lot of goods and services? Probably not. We've seen that movie before, like communist Russia. Now let's go back to the 1800s and assume that government spending. And I know this is a flawed metric. I get it. I understand that's not perfect, and GDP back then was different, and M2 is a very vague number, and the CPI, it's understated. But if your argument is the CPI is understated, by the way, if you corrected for the right CPI from 90 to 2020, it just makes my point even more powerful, or just adds to what I'm saying. It doesn't detract from it, because real GDP would go down, right? But regardless, these are the key components that I think you need to look at if you're really trying to solve the problem for inflation. Because you could say, okay, well, inflation is slavery, fiat is inflation, but that implies that fiat M2 money supply grows a lot more with fiat. And let's remember that from 90 to 2020, it grew by 400% when we were on a strict fiat standard, but yet it grew by the exact same amount from 1870 to 1900 when we were on a strict gold standard. So listen, again, I think it's desirable to have sound money, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that we're not going to have an increase in M2 if that's what consumers want. And you say, well, we have full reserve. Why didn't we have full reserve back then? And it gets to this weird point where if you're a libertarian, especially, you would say, all right, well, if we go into a sound money standard, let's say, if the free market chose fractional reserve banking like it did back then, you would literally have to have the state, ironically enough, come in and say, no, that's illegal. You can only do full reserve because we need to fix money supply. So it's kind of weird there. But anyway, my main point, and I don't know I'm going about this a roundabout way, and I apologize, but if that is what you're trying to get at, I think your mental bandwidth would be better allocated to, instead of focusing on fiat and slavery, focusing on government spending as a percentage of GDP and communism, which I guess you could say is almost slavery.